Right, which leaves us, Scott, with colour out of space. When is a colour not a colour? There are two answers I will accept, one of which is when you're Rhythm Nation. On the off chance that you're not down to discuss Janet Jackson, I will instead refer you to the second acceptable answer, which would be when it is colour out of space. If that means nothing to you, then I can only assume you're no fan of H.P. Lovecraft. The Gardner family have, we learn, abandoned city life for the comfort of remote New England woodlands, occupying a grand old house once belonging to the father of patriarch Nathan, Nick Cage. While Nathan's focus alternates between cooking dubious meals, drinking bourbon, and tending his alpacas, they're the animal of the future, his wife Teresa, Jolie Richardson, maintains income by trading stocks over a tenuous satellite internet connection. Their three children are, in descending order of age, a developing stoner, a Wiccan witch, and a relatively normal young lad of about 7 or 8. Into this idyllic, if disorganised world, comes one night a meteorite, landing just outside the Gardner home next to their well. Initially shrugged off by authorities and somewhat made fun of by a local news channel, the otherworldly interloper soon proves to be more unusual and problematic than it first appears, as it transpires to be a vessel for a colour beyond description, a colour that begins to infect and mutate everything in the surrounding area, including the Gardners. Ooh. Generally regarded as one of its author's finer short stories, Colour Out of Space has been adapted a few times now, and while I've never seen any of the other attempts, I can understand why it's an attractive source material. The text is vivid in its description of the setting, suggestive enough in its narration to be unsettling, but vague enough in plot and detail around the events that befall the Gardners to make it an attractive scaffold upon which to hang any number of potential themes. With that in mind, I'll begin my observations on a positive. This movie is certainly at the better end of the quality spectrum as far as Lovecraft adaptations go. Though as many listeners will appreciate, that statement comes with the caveat that the bar by which we measure this is pretty low. Part of the problem faced by filmmakers in adapting Lovecraft across the decades, and stop me if you heard this before, has been the author's reliance on suggestion rather than explicit description when conveying the horrors that have unfolded, compounded by the fact we are often being related these stories after the fact by a narrator who may or may not have been directly adjacent to said events. Colour Out of Space was one of Lovecraft's first stories to establish this style, and in bringing an entirely implied menace to a visual medium, director Richard Stanley faces all the same issues as his peers. It's relatively easy to label a colour as indescribable in text, but how do you show me that on film? For the most part, Stanley, who works here from a script he co-wrote, does an admirable job of setting up both the family and the menace. Nathan, Teresa, Ben, Lavinia and Jack are, in spite of some potentially irritable idiosyncrasies, a pretty likeable family with a laudable conviction to their change in lifestyle. Cage in particular is as good as I've probably seen him in some time, making Nathan broadly relatable even as he demonstrates to a nonplussed onlooker the intricacies of correctly milking an alpaca. Cage channels his inner weirdness in a way that is immediately gently humorous to the point of endearing, sparing us a city-escaping archetype who might otherwise have been insufferable. Similarly, Richardson avoids falling into stereotype as the power mother, keeping her stock trading frustrations to a minimum, and together with Cage, she engages us emotionally as we witness some tender moments between the couple, centred around Teresa's recovery from a cancer operation. My chief gripe, arguably the more important of the two major ones I have, is that the point at which we start to witness the meteor's ill effects denotes a pretty sharp demarcation between this and a complete halt to any character development. Just as we're coming to empathise with these characters, we become distracted by the shift in focus towards the bizarre, and the next thing we know, all hell is breaking loose. Here we come to the second concern, which is that Stanley inevitably falls into the age-old trap of showing, not telling the horror, and in this case, it's time that would have been better spent getting to know the family dynamic and, as a consequence, anything resembling a theme. I bring theme into this not because it's necessary for a horror movie, but because I have the feeling Stanley is trying to work something grander into the mix, and I really wanted him to succeed. For example, enough reference is made to Nathan's drinking habits that I'd be tempted to suggest the colour is actually an analogue for his habit. The news report scene plays into this with humour, and every time Nathan pours a drink, the camera really wants me to notice the increasingly odd chromatic tendencies of the ice, but nothing much else comes of it. Similarly, Teresa's implied battle with cancer would easily play into the body horror aspects that emerge increasingly toward the film's final act. But if that's the case, it's not really enough just to mention the word and then never really revisit it. There is still much to like here, though by the time we reach the final couple of reels, most of which feels lifted almost directly from the 2011 remake of The Thing, it's only really Cage's performance that holds matters together. And by holding together, I mean like duct tape can technically hold a bike together, so long as you're not planning on going off any sweet jumps. I was partly sold on Colour Out of Space on the basis that it was full Cage. However, I have to report at Peak Madness, this is more 85% Cage, give or take. If nothing else, one must remember this is Stanley's first film in 23 years, following the debacle of Dr. Moreau. And it's not without promise, considering the director has stated he would subsequently like to tackle Lovecraft's The Dunwich Horror. Nonetheless, I can't help but wonder what might have been had this fallen into the more capable hands of someone who understands creeping intensity like Shane Carruth, or character like, for example, Marielle Heller. I was slightly disappointed with this, Scott, after a strong start. I'm intrigued to hear what you find.
It came very close. I think, just to put my broken record back on again, if this was about 20 minutes shorter, it's pushing, it's not quite 2 hours, 1 hour 50 maybe, from memory. I think it could have done with compressing some of its horror moments into a shorter time to kind of build that a bit more, to kind of ramp that up a little bit more. Because it spends awful lot of time, well, particularly showing, not telling, the body horror aspects of which you describe, while a shocking and horrible thing is also lingered on for long enough for it to become ridiculous to the point where it was actually laughing at it, and that's obviously not what you want from a horror film.
That needed to be one scene.
Yes. I mean, the way that sort of resolves itself is a really creepy moment, but unfortunately it's something that's been slightly undercut by the 7 or 8 scenes before it, which have kind of lingered over it. It could have done with being a bit more focused on trying to get to the scary bits, particularly when a lot of what it does in other elements kind of works pretty well. It does a reasonable job of... I think Lovecraft's always difficult to adapt, because anything when horror is cosmic in scale, it's not even personal enough to really care about what's killing you. It's not like it's a vengeful spirit trying to do something. It's something completely incomprehensible to anyone who's looking at it or going to be trying to tackle it, and that's going to be very difficult to try and get across. And this does a pretty reasonable job for a lot of it, and the way that it kind of, just the weird things that are happening, and the way that it's done subtle things to some characters at some points before ramping up into the extremes, and most of that works pretty well. It just can't quite land it at the end because it's gone on for a little bit too long.
See, that's what I mean by because you've hit the nail on the head about talking about the cosmic scale of the horror. It's that thing we've discussed before in like superhero movies and stuff, where if the stakes are the end of the world, if the stakes or the protagonist something so large that it's almost unimaginable, then your movie needs to be about something else.
Yes.
And it's really frustrating. It's really frustrating because it feels like this movie sets out to be about something else and then just gives up on it.
Yes, and then becomes too obsessed with just painting everything sort of pinkish purple and having people stare at things. And it's always going to be a tough thing to try and do. And I think this might be as well as you can do it. I'm not, as we've said many times before, nothing's not, it's not that anything is unadaptable, but perhaps certain things just aren't going to work in this format, and this is perhaps I hope I'm proven wrong, but I think a lot of what Lovecraft tries to do is something that can't quite be replicated on anything other than that. It's trying to put the visuals of something that is undescribable in text is always going to be very difficult, and this doesn't quite land it.
Yeah, but you almost have to do something entirely different if you're going to convey it visually. I spent a lot of time last night and this morning thinking about exactly this same thing, Scott. And when I think most about it, do you know what the most successful Lovecraft adaptations have been? Are audio productions.
Yeah.
So there are Lovecraft podcasts out there, and because it's purely an audible medium, and because the visual aspect is left to your imagination, those work so much better. And I wonder, as you've just touched on there, whether or not really there's any point in trying to adapt Lovecraft for film if you're going to stick broadly to the text without doing something really quite radical with it.
I think the more senses you try and involve, because the harder it gets. And what brings us up is the point where Nick Cage's character, he thinks that the smell of this meteorite is a kind of meteorite that falls to Earth is disgusting to him, but no one else notices it, and you kind of wonder why it's that done. Then it kind of gets explained later on. But again, the only way you can get across that this is a bad smell is by him going, "Ooh, this smells bad," which is clumsy. And what it's trying to get to is the nature that because this is a horror that is operating on senses and scales that we don't have. This is synesthesia or whatever that is. All that kind of made writ large, but it's clumsy to do a show on film. It would be better just not to do it at all, or come up with it in a different way, because just having go, "Oh God, that smells bad," is just weird. It doesn't quite work on a film. In many ways, the less senses that you can involve when you're talking about something as unimaginable as what Lovecraft horror tends to be about is perhaps the only way you can do it, by having all that just run riot in your mind and coming up with whatever horrors you can come up with in your head, which is the meta problem of every horror film. It generally is scarier to have the things that you don't see rather than the things that actually do. So when it does show you, and what it's come up with as its horror vector, it tends not to be as convincing as something you could have come up with by yourself to your own, tailored to your own personal horrors. When if you was just to describe two people fusing together, I think you could probably come up with a pretty disgusting mental image that is perhaps not reflected in what the special effects artists have managed to come up with here, which is not so good. So it's ambitious, and I applaud that, and I didn't hate it. I don't think I've said this in the way all I've been talking about it. I actually relatively enjoyed this. I certainly was not at any point bored in the 1 hour 50 minutes. I can't quite bring myself to recommend it, but I do on a lot of levels appreciate the work and the craft that's gone into it. Cage's performance is good, but as is I think everyone else in there, even Cheech, is it Cheech or Chong? I forget.
Tommy Chong.
Chong. Even he's doing pretty well in his role. There's a lot of things that I can applaud in this, but ultimately it doesn't quite hang together. It's one of the more memorable horror films I've seen. It's probably actually sitting on the same level of interesting curiosity for me as In the Mouth of Madness.
Yeah, I thought you might say that
one, which is the same one. It's like I appreciate the effort that's been gone into it. I don't think it's quite landed to it, but it's ambitious, and I like that you've done it. It's more interesting than most horror films that are of much smaller outlooks, but ultimately it doesn't quite stick the landing.
Yeah, I wondered if you might mention In the Mouth of Madness, because in my mind this sits there with that as well. As like I'm not going to be massively compelled to come back and watch this again anytime soon, but I understand why other people do like it. And to be clear, it is a swing and a hit, but it's not a home run. It's Richard Stanley's gotten to first or second base, I think, on this, but
which is not what you want to do with a Cthulhian horror, really.
Well, listen, man, I'm not going to kink shame him. Let's not go down that route. But yeah, it's certainly interesting. If you were a fan of the authors, as I broadly am, I suppose there are several of his works that I really, really like, and a good deal of his work that I don't. Then yes, I would say go ahead and check it out. It does sort of make me slightly relieved, though, that we never did get Guillermo del Toro's At the Mountains of Madness, because he strikes me as someone who really is a really strongly visual director, and I don't know, based on his works now and seeing the experience that Richard Stanley's had with this movie, that I necessarily think, for all that people were getting really excited about the fact that, we're going to get a proper Lovecraft movie, I don't think it would have been. But we'll never know. I can't say I shared their enthusiasm for that. I think there's that's another one of those that would live best in the audio realm, I think. Yeah,
it may be the case that there is no such thing as a proper Lovecraft adaptation on film, and in a way I'd probably argue there's probably the same. You could maybe say the same thing about. What a terrible time for his name to pop out of my head. Sci-fi author you love, Philip K. Dick. It's I'm not sure there's been a proper Philip K. Dick adaptation either.
No.
Take elements that has of his work that's been had and kind of spin it into something else. But I mean, the closest you could come to would probably be A Scanner Darkly, which was a very abstract take, at least in terms of a film, of that work. And as I said, it's not that it's unadaptable. It's just that the adaptations may not really be possible to do the source material justice.
Well, the reason Blade Runner works is because it takes a broad theme from the source material and does something essentially completely different with it. I mean, that movie has got almost no resemblance whatsoever to Android's Dream of Electric Sheep. And I think similarly with this, where this is what I mean by Colour Out of Space is a good horror story to hang something else entirely on thematically. You could get away with making a really great family drama about how a family falls apart for various reasons if the Colour Out of Space is analogous to the father's drinking habits or the mother's pursuit of her career, or something to do with the way her cancer has affected the family dynamic or something like that. But it would have to be first and foremost a family drama and not a horror about the colour magenta.
Yes.
So that's the only way I can envisage something like this working, because at the point at which you show a fused mass of dogs and alpacas in a barn and Nick Cage going mental and blowing their heads off with a shotgun, it's like, reading the short story. And I had to... It'd been a few years, quite some time since I'd actually read Colour Out of Space. So immediately after watching the film last night, I went to bed and read through it in my bed. And it's like, there is none of this in the short story. It's all a second-hand telling of something that happened like 50 years previously, and none of that horror is explicitly described. It's purely, the only description is of the mental effect that certain events which took place took on the father of the family, who in the novel is Nahum. And we are told what happened to his family, but the only interaction any character has with anyone is someone who's telling the story of their relationship that they had with Nahum and how they witnessed him change to a third party who's visiting, and there's very little else by way of description of the actual events. So they have made, or Richard Stanley has made, a conscious choice to amplify the visual horror aspect of this, whereas I would argue you have to take absolutely the opposite route. But I mean, an admirable attempt for all that, and I did enjoy a good deal of it. I think the first hour of it's pretty strong, but I would argue that for the most part, the second half of it sort of descends a little bit too much into madness and with not enough focus on the characters. So
yes, I agree, but I would still be very interested in seeing if we can see the Dunwich horror as he hopes to get to. I would like to see that movie, so I hope it gets made.
Here's what worries me about that, is that if I recall correctly, because again, it's been a long time since I read the book, but that short story does culminate in a pretty... it's one of the few times, I think, where something is described visually quite explicitly, I think, for a Lovecraft, or unless I'm confusing it with another story. That's the one about the thing living in the barn, right?
I think it is, yes. It's been a long time for myself as well. So
yes. I want to say that culminates in something a little bit more explicit in the book, so that maybe worries me a bit, because I think that might work even less well potentially on film. But hey, what do I know? I will say this for Richard Stanley, he's made more movies than I have. And I would trust him more with a movie than I would trust myself. So yeah, I did quite like this for the most part, but again, I'm not gonna be rushing back to watch it again anytime soon, unless we have a compelling reason to do so.
Yes, I agree.